But actually, it's a completely incoherent biological category because of the amount of genetic diversity that exists in people from who are in Africa or from the African diasporas. So how this relates to the transatlantic slave trade means that you've got two people taken from maybe neighboring tribes or counties or whatever the equivalent is, or countries, who are taken from their birthplace, put onto ships, mixed around, they live or die, they then traded around, forcibly mated potentially. We know from the genetics now that there is a lot of European DNA in the African American genome, and mostly it is from male Europeans into female African Americans. So, figure that out. Interestingly, the converse is also true. Many white Americans have up to 20% of African ancestry that we can measure in their DNA. So again, it's another example of how...
There was a mixed race Medici, I believe. I can't remember if it was a Cosimo or an Alessandro de Medici, whose father was obviously an Italian aristocrat, part of one of the most powerful families in Italian history, and whose mother was an African servant. But this mixed race Medici, his children then married into the rest of the Italian aristocracy, and it was never spoken of again, because after that, race as categories of human who must never be mixed became more and more historically important, and nobody wanted to talk about the African blood that was in their families.
Well, that in America it becomes formalized as the one drop rule. So there's a moment in the 17th century where the difference between hypodescent and hyperdescent flips legally. So that is where you take on what status.
So wait, what's hyperdescent and hypodescent?
The legal status of a child is inherited from the more or less powerful cultural parent. So hypodescent is inheriting it from typically from the mother. Hyperdescent is, I think I've got that the right way around, from the father. But anyway, the point is that in the 17th century there was a legal challenge to this, because a boy was born of a mixed partnership, an English lawyer and an enslaved woman, and the child inherited the status of the father. Now, the Virginia Assembly weren't happy with this, and so they flipped the law. So, which meant that the pairing of a white person with a black person, the child will always inherit the legal status of the black person from that point onwards. And then over the course of the next, couple of centuries, as racism becomes enshrined and legalized, sort of formally legalized ever more into what becomes known as the one drop rule, which is that if you have any ancestor who is African or African American, then you legally are a black person. And the absurdity of this is perhaps best showcased in Thomas Jefferson having 6 children with, we think, as a sitting president, all of whom looked white but were legally black and therefore legally born into slavery. So you've got this situation where the sitting president, one of the founding fathers, has children with Sally Heming, who herself is mixed race, and they are born enslaved, which is an absurdity. They're ostensibly white people, as the social definition goes. Now, the one drop rule continued in America. This now trips over into the other book, the eugenics book, because a big part of the story of eugenics is the ultimate realization of this type of thinking during the Holocaust. In 1930s Germany, the Nazis were trying to establish the rules of inheritance so that you could determine who was pure German, Aryan, and who was Jewish. And they looked at the one drop rule, they looked at the American framework for it and decided that it was too strict.